The fluorescent lights in the school auditorium hummed with a low, electric vibration that Jolene felt in the marrow of her bones. Behind the heavy velvet curtain, she stood frozen, clutching a flash drive so tightly the plastic edges bit into her palm. Through a sliver in the fabric, she could see her husband, Wade, sitting in the front row, his posture impeccable and his smile radiating the calm authority of a man who owned every soul in the room. He caught her eye for a split second and winked. A silent, terrifying reminder that he had already seen her notes and emptied her bank accounts. He thought the cage was finally locked. The principal's voice boomed over the speakers, introducing her to the expectant crowd of parents and police officers. Jolene's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she stepped toward the podium, her shadow stretching long and jagged across the stage. As she plugged the drive into the laptop, the screen flickered to life, reflecting in Wade's darkening eyes. This wasn't the presentation they had practiced at home. The first slide didn't contain a title or a greeting. It was a grainy, high-definition photo of a secret she was never supposed to find. And the silence that fell over the room was so heavy, it felt like the air itself had vanished. The fluorescent lights in the teacher's lounge buzzed like trapped insects, casting a sickly glow over the chipped formica table where Jolene Carter sat with her palms pressed flat against the surface. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, a greasy film congealing on top. But she didn't notice. Her fingers traced the grain of the wood beneath the laminate, counting the knots like rosary beads, 1, 2, 3. While the clock above the microwave ticked out the seconds in slow, deliberate pulses. Across the room, Mrs. Green's laughter cut through the hum of the vending machine, sharp and forced. Jolene didn't turn. She knew what she'd see. The history teacher's shoulders hunched, her knuckles white around the strap of her purse, eyes darting toward the door like a cornered animal. The air smelled of burnt popcorn and the antiseptic tang of the janitor's mop water. But beneath it all lingered the metallic bite of Jolene's own sweat, sour and sharp. Her phone vibrated against her thigh. She didn't need to look. The message would be from Wade. "Where are you?" Or, "Don't keep me waiting." Delivered in that same tone he used when adjusting his cufflinks, as if punctuality were a moral failing. The screen lit up again, casting blue shadows across her lap. She exhaled through her nose, slow and controlled, and slid the device into her pocket without reading it. Outside the window, the playground equipment cast long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. A gust of wind sent a crumpled soda can skittering past the glass, the sound like bones rattling in a dry gourd. Jolene pressed her forehead against the cool pane. Somewhere beyond the chain-link fence, a car horn blared, then faded. She counted to 10, then to 20. The clock ticked. The lights buzzed. And for the first time in months, she let herself wonder what it would feel like to walk out that door and never look back. The hallway outside the lounge remained a tunnel of institutional beige, smelling of floor wax and the ghosts of 1,000 sandwiches. Jolene smoothed her skirt, the fabric stiff under her nervous palms. She moved toward her office, her gait measured, practiced. Inside, the air felt stagnant. A teenager sat in the chair opposite her desk, his sneakers splattered with dried neon paint, thudding rhythmically against the metal leg of the chair. Thump, thump, thump. The boy's eyes were frantic, darting toward the door as if expecting an executioner. "You should understand that this isn't about punishment, but—" "Punishment," Jolene said, her voice a thin film of ice over a deep, dark lake. She repeated the word as a ritual, a way to anchor herself in the reality of the room. "Jolene thinks you're holding something back. Jolene thinks you're afraid." She often spoke of herself in the third person when the walls felt too close, as if Jolene Carter were a character she was merely observing. The boy didn't answer. He only kicked the chair harder. Jolene watched him, her heart echoing the frantic beat of his shoes. She knew that fear. It was a living thing, a parasite that fed on silence. When the bell finally rang, the sound felt like a gunshot. The boy scrambled out, leaving Jolene in a silence so heavy it pressed the breath from her lungs. Driving home through the humid Mississippi twilight, the air felt like a damp wool blanket. The humidity clung to the oak trees, draped in Spanish moss that looked like rotting lace. She pulled the car into the gravel driveway of the house on Oak Street. A house that looked perfect from the road, with its white picket fence and the roses Jolene tended with a desperate, manic devotion. Wade was already there. His silhouette stood framed in the living room window, a dark, immovable pillar of rectitude. Dinner was a theater of precision. Wade sat at the head of the table, his movements fluid and predatory. He cut his steak with surgical accuracy, the silver screeching against the fine china. "You were 4 minutes late, Jolene," he said, not looking up. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that filled the room until there was no space left for her own breath. "The school is only 6 minutes away. Jolene is losing track of time. Time. I was helping a student," she whispered, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "He was hurting. Wade laid the knife down. The sound was final. "I don't like it when you're late. It suggests a lack of respect for the order we've built. Order. He smiled then, but the warmth never reached his dark, obsidian eyes. He reached across the table and squeezed her wrist. His thumb pressed into the bone, a reminder of the strength hidden beneath his tailored sleeve. "I do this because I love you, Jolene. Because without me, you would simply drift away." Later that night, when the house was a tomb of shadows, Jolene crept out to the backyard. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through her slippers. She made her way to the old wooden garden shed, the door groaning on its rusted hinges. Inside, it smelled of damp earth and fertilizer. She reached under a loose floorboard near the back wall, her fingers grazing something cold and metallic. A locked box. She had found the key weeks ago, hidden in the back of Wade's sock drawer. When the lid creaked open, her world fractured. Inside were stacks of letters, handwritten on blue stationery. They were from Emily, her sister. Letters Jolene had never seen. "Why don't you answer me?" one read. "Did I do something wrong?" There were also printouts of Jolene's own emails, messages she thought she'd sent to her mother, to friends from college. They had all been intercepted. Every digital cry for help had been snared in a web she hadn't even known existed. Jolene felt a cold, sharp blade of clarity pierce through her chest. He hadn't just watched her. He had rewritten her reality. He had made her believe she was abandoned. She clutched the letters to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The next morning, the sun rose over the delta with a vengeful heat. Jolene pulled into the Lucky Star gas station, her hands shaking so hard she could barely grip the steering wheel. She needed to run. She needed to find Emily. She walked to the counter, the smell of cheap coffee and stale cigarettes making her stomach churn. She handed her credit card to the clerk, a man with a tired face and a permanent scowl. The terminal emitted a sharp, mocking beep. "Declined," the clerk mumbled. "Try this one," Jolene said, handing over a second card. Beep. Declined. Her phone vibrated. A notification from her banking app. "Your accounts have been temporarily frozen by the primary account holder." Jolene stared at the screen, the blue light blinding. He knew. He had cut the cord. She felt the clerk's gaze on her, heavy and suspicious. She turned and fled back to the car. the gravel crunching under her feet like breaking teeth. As she drove back toward the house, she saw a black and white cruiser idling near their gate. Sheriff Hancock. He didn't move as she passed, but she felt his eyes behind the tinted glass. He was Wade's friend, a man who shared Wade's taste for control and bourbon. The town felt like a tightening noose. Every neighbor behind a curtain, every officer on the beat. They were all part of the architecture of her prison. Wade was waiting for her in the kitchen. On the oak table sat her car keys, the silver horseshoe keychain glinting. "You went to the gas station," he said. It wasn't a question. "Jolene is trying to leave." "But Jolene has nowhere to go." He picked up the keys and slid them into his pocket. The sound of the metal hitting his thigh was the sound of a cell door closing. "I'll be driving you to work from now on," he said softly. "For your own safety. You've been so unstable lately." Unstable. In the school hallways, the atmosphere had changed. Jolene tried to catch Linda Green's eye near the lockers. Linda, who usually shared a joke about the principal's toupee, suddenly became fascinated by a stack of history exams. She scurried away, her face flushing crimson. Jolene realized then that the poison had reached the school. Wade had been talking. He had been planting seeds of doubt about her mental state, draping his control in the guise of a concerned, suffering husband. She retreated to her office, the small room that used to be her sanctuary. She looked up and saw it, a small black dome near the smoke detector. A camera. The red light blinked with a steady, rhythmic pulse. It was a mechanical eye, a proxy for Wade's gaze. She stood on her chair to look closer, her fingers trembling. The brand name on the casing belonged to Wade's security firm. He was watching her now, even here, recording every sigh, every moment of despair. She sat at her computer, her fingers hovering over the keys. She tried to log into her personal email, but a gray banner blocked the screen. Access restricted by network administrator. He had thought of everything. He had bought the school's new computer lab. He owned the IT department's loyalty. She was a ghost in the machine, a flicker of data he could delete at will. "Right," Wade said that evening, pushing a blank sheet of paper and a sharpened pencil toward her. They sat at the kitchen table. The house felt like a fortress, the windows recently fitted with heavy iron grates that Wade called decorative. "I need a full account of your day," he instructed. "Every minute. From the time I dropped you off to the time I picked you up. Jolene needs to be honest. Honest." She wrote. She accounted for every second, her handwriting cramped and ugly. When the pencil lead snapped, Wade replaced it immediately, his eyes never leaving her face. He was a predator watching a wounded bird, waiting for the final flutter of resistance to cease. "And what about the Green Valley brochure I found in your bag?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Jolene froze. She hadn't put a brochure in her bag. "It's a wonderful place, Jolene. Quiet, secure. They help women who have lost their way, women who think their husbands are monsters. I've already spoken to Dr. Stern. He agrees that a period of isolation would be beneficial." Beneficial. The threat was no longer veiled. He was preparing to disappear her into a private asylum, a place where her screams would be treated as symptoms. The day of the annual parent-teacher night arrived like a thunderstorm. The school was alive with the sound of folding chairs and the smell of floor wax. This was it. Her last chance. She had spent the last few days in the computer lab, ostensibly working on a presentation about student psychology, but secretly weaving a different narrative. She had used the school's offline server, the one place Wade's reach couldn't quite touch. Wade was in her office that afternoon, his presence suffocating. He took her staff ID card and a pair of heavy shears. With a slow, deliberate motion, he cut the plastic in half. "You won't be needing this after tonight," he said. "You'll be resigning. For your health. Everyone understands. They've seen how you've been acting. He forced her to sit before her mirror that evening, applying her makeup with a heavy hand. He covered the bruises on her arms with thick concealer, his touch clinical and cold. He chose a dress with a high collar, a dark blue silk that felt like a shroud. "You look perfect," he whispered, zipping the dress up so tight she could barely expand her ribs. My perfect Jolene. But Jolene had one thing he didn't know about. A small, battered flash drive she had hidden in the lining of her jacket. As she did her hair, she tucked the drive into a heavy silver barrette, the metal teeth biting into her scalp. When Wade complimented her hairstyle, she smiled at him in the mirror, a cold, hollow expression that mirrored his own. The auditorium was a sea of faces. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and the low hum of 100 conversations. Wade sat in the front row, his arm draped over the back of the chair, the image of a proud, supportive husband. To his left sat Sheriff Hancock, to his right, Pastor Wilson. They were the triumvirate of the town, the pillars of a society that didn't like to look beneath the surface. Jolene stepped onto the stage. The spotlights were blinding, white-hot circles that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird wanting out. She approached the lectern, her fingers brushing the cold wood. She reached up, unclipped the barrette, and slid the flash drive into the laptop. The screen behind her flickered to life. "Tonight, we are here to talk about the psychology of the adolescent," Jolene began, her voice steady, a thin wire of steel. "But to understand the child, we must understand the environment. We must understand the nature of control." Control. Wade shifted in his seat. His smile faltered. She clicked the remote. The first slide was a standard diagram of a family tree. But as she spoke, the images changed. Suddenly, the screen filled with a screenshot of an email. Wade's email to the bank, demanding Jolene be cut off from her own money. A murmur rippled through the room. "Control begins with isolation," Jolene said, her voice rising. "It begins with the theft of a voice." She clicked again. Now, the auditorium was filled with Wade's voice, a recording she had made on her phone months ago. "If you ever try to leave, Jolene, I will make sure the world thinks you're insane. I own the sheriff. I own the doctors. You are nothing without me. Nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Wade stood up, his face a mask of purple rage. He moved toward the stage, but the gym teacher, Mr. Lewis, stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. "Sit down, Wade," Lewis said, his voice low and dangerous. Jolene didn't stop. She showed the photos of the shredded letters from her sister. She showed the logs of the spyware he had installed on her phone. She showed the receipts for the Green Valley deposit. "This is not just my story," Jolene cried out, her voice breaking the heavy air. "This is the story of this town. A town that watches and says nothing. A town that lets a man like this build a cage and call it a home." Wade lunged for the stage, but he was swarmed. The fathers of the students she had helped, the men who had seen the kindness in her eyes and the fear in her gait, held him back. Sheriff Hancock stood up, looking at the screen, then at Wade. The sheriff was a man of many sins, but he knew when a tide had turned. He looked away, leaving Wade alone in a vacuum of public shame. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and the sudden, overwhelming noise of a life being reclaimed. Wade was gone, driven out by the sheer weight of the town's collective realization. He couldn't exist in a world where he was seen for what he truly was. Weeks later, Jolene sat on her porch. The iron grates were gone, the windows open to the sweet, heavy scent of Mississippi jasmine. The house felt light now, as if the walls had finally learned how to breathe. In her hand was a letter. A real letter, delivered by a postman who looked her in the eye and smiled. It was from Emily. "I'm coming to get you, Jolene. We're going home." Jolene leaned back in the creaking chair. She didn't jump when a car drove by. She didn't count the knots in the wood. She simply watched the fireflies dance in the tall grass, their light flickering like the first tentative pulses of a new heart. She was Jolene Carter. And for the first time in her life, she was exactly who she was meant to be.